Hello, good afternoon to everyone here, and good morning to any of our Western Australian counterparts. I'm Rowan, and with me today is my team member Sharissa.
Hi everyone.
Excellent. And so this is part 2 of our workflow automation series. Now, if you missed part 1, just to recap, in that we looked at some of the very simple workflow automations you can send up, things such as sending out basic reminders about upcoming training or sending ad hoc emails to all of your students. As a reminder, Workflow is a Turbo exclusive feature, so if you're wondering where some of the features are that we're looking at today, if you can't see them in your account, that may be because you're on a standard license. Now today, we're going to be looking at some of the more complicated workflow tasks you can set up compared to the simple ones. We did cover one towards the end of our last session where we looked at how to use a report to power a large-scale automation for that ad hoc email. A lot of the automations we'll be examining today will use that same principle, so especially those things regarding to sending invoices and finance. Remember, the general rule of thumb is if that you're trying to set up a simple workflow and it can't really do it, often you can actually build a report and use the results of that to power a much larger scale automation. Now, before we jump into those more complicated sets, we're going to take a step back and look at a more simple automation at first, mainly to highlight the use of some dynamic fields, which is something we haven't really touched on before and you may not have been aware of up until this point. So, without further ado, we shall jump into our first example here.
Alright, so let's have a look at this example. So essentially, if you're using our online assessments feature in aXcelerate, this will be a fantastic workflow for you to set up where we essentially email the trainer to let them know that a student has submitted an assessment through aXcelerate.
Yeah, they may be able to check via the online assessments widget, but this just sends an email reminder to really reinforce the point that they need to get on their marking. So we'll jump into the system now.
Yes. So to set up this workflow, all you have to do is to head straight into workflow and we'll set up a new automated task. Okay, we'll quickly give this workflow a name.
Yep, so we'll call this assessment to be marked reminder.
Yep. All right, and we do have a very specific workflow action for this scenario, and it's called handle assessment status change. So all you have to do is search for the keyword assessment, click into it, and workflow by default will set the recipient to the student. So this is actually a drop-down list where you can click on and select who you wish to send the email to. So you have all these options here, and if you're not sure what they mean, just simply hover over the eye information icon to where it will have more specific definitions of that. So in this particular workflow scenario, we want to send it to the assessor.
Yeah, let the people who should be marking it, let them know that there is something to be marked.
Yep, and we'll run the wizard. Now, by default, the wizard will pre-populate all the key actions for you, so we're not going to touch any of that. We're also not going to select a pre-configured template. Instead, we are going to use the message that's provided by aXcelerate.
If you recall back to our part 1 of the webinar, we may have suggested that most of the time you'll be wanting to set a template here. This time we actually can't do that because of those dynamic fields that were mentioned earlier.
That's correct. So if you have used Workflow before and have been wondering what this television icon is all about, this is a great opportunity to explain what this does. So when you hit the TV icon, it will take you through a list of drop-down fields. So let's click into it and see what we've got here. So as Ron mentioned earlier, these are all the dynamic fields relating to the actual assessment instance or assessment details. The reason why we use the TV icon is because these fields are not found in the template area in aXcelerate. I'm going to scroll down this list and I'm going to look for a very specific one called the student's contact ID, because this is the closest field that takes us to the actual student details of the person who submitted the assessment. So I'm going to click OK. It's going to pop this weird code with the percentage symbol, so I am going to copy that.
Cut that out.
Okay, and I'm going to paste it in the new line. So it's essentially providing a student ID. What I want to do is put a descriptor in front of it called student number.
Yep.
Okay, so what this message template does is every time a student submits an assessment, Workflow is going to send the trainer the email providing the student name, or the student ID in this case, as well as a direct link to the assessment instance itself. So the trainer can click into the link and start marking this submission. So it does contain some special coding to take the trainer straight into the assessment itself.
Yep. So that blue text there was by default, but we've put in that student number there so that if the student doesn't want to go straight to the marking side of things, they can just jump into the search contacts part of aXcelerate and just search up the number there.
That's right. Now, if you wish to customize the signature even more, you certainly can at this point. And as we scroll down this list, we'll leave the subject as default. And most importantly, you do want to click the dynamic value over here to wrap up this workflow action. So if I click into it, it will specify the learning activity ID.
Yep. If you don't click on that, then when the trainer clicks that blue text, it may not actually take them anywhere. So it's pretty critical that you click dynamic value at the end there.
Yep. And so if you're happy with how this workflow has been set up, all you have to do is update step, and it's going to take you back into this area. So as you can see, this has been set up as an advanced workflow, which essentially means it's a multi-step workflow. The first thing aXcelerate is going to look at is if there's any changes made to the assessment, and if yes, it's going to send an email to the assessor.
You can see the thing that's governing whether that change happens is in the when to run section. So currently the trigger is set to assessment submission. So when to text that an assessment has been submitted, that's when it will try and send the message to the trainer. So this is basically set up to as we want it in this case.
Yep. And as you can see, when I click down into the drop-down list, I am presented with two options. So it's either the assessment submission or the assessment marked. So with this particular workflow, you can start thinking about all the different possible notifications you can trigger off this particular action. So for example, if you want to notify the students that the assessment has been marked, then all you have to do is to select the trigger, change the recipient to the student, and that's all pretty much how you set it up.
Yeah, you could also get more specific. You could send one when it's marked successful or when it's marked failed. A number of different things you can do based upon these different triggers.
That's correct. So in this case, what I want to do is to keep it as submission and simply save the automated task.
Yep, and there we go, sitting ready to go. I see a question in the chat there that yes, normally you probably wouldn't have to send too many emails to trainers to mark them if you're using the online assessments widget. But as Shritz has mentioned, if you're using this to send reminders to students about something's being marked, it's effectively the same thing, just with a different trigger and recipient.
That's right. So that pretty much wraps up how you can set up assessment-related triggers through workflow. So moving on, let's have a look at the second example.
Yep. So in this one, we're going to look at handling situations where trainer documents may be expiring. So we encourage you to upload evidence into aXcelerate to support trainers' competencies. But of course, those documents may expire. Often when you have like first aid trainers, they might have a CPR qualification that expires in like 6 months. So you'll have to stay on top of that. This task can help you and the trainers understand what needs to be replaced and updated.
That's correct. So it can be licenses, it can be certain quals, certifications that needs to be updated. So for this workflow to work, we do need a report from aXcelerate. So we have saved a report. Let's just jump into report.
Yep.
Okay, so let's look at our save report. So in this case, we have the contact portfolio expiring documents report all set up. So let's hit play and see how this filters have been configured.
Yeah, you can see this is a standard sort of contact portfolio warehouse report, but our filters are making sure it's looking at something specific. We're looking at certain portfolio document types. You can see here the trainer specific ones. We've set these up to be specific for trainers. That way we don't get confused with a student's CPR qualification. We don't want to remind trainers about that. We want to remind people when it's a trainer related document.
Yeah, so if you are a first aid provider, then it is pretty much a good habit or best practice to try and segregate your trainer's qualifications so as not to confuse the report. We also have set the expiry date to a range to look for expiring documents between 10 and 90 days ahead. And finally, we have also included contact categories, looking for contract trainers or trainers to be really, really specific.
Yeah, we've been diligent and made sure that we've set contact categories against all of our trainers, so no student should have either of those two categories. So we definitely make sure all the people in this report should actually be trainers.
Yep. Now let's have a look at our display fields in the report. Okay, as you can see, these are all typically the default fields that the report will include. So I'm not going to take anything out or add anything extra, but we do want to make sure that the contact IDs in the report, which should have been in there by default, because the contact ID is what Workflow uses to send the emails out to the people in the report.
If you recall back to part 1 of our webinar, one of the last workflows we looked at, in fact, used this, and contact ID was important for it. We'll be effectively taking the save report and plugging it into the workflow engine to send a reminder to everyone who shows up on the report.
That's right. So once you click done, let's run the report and see who's expiring their documents. Okay, so we do have a Heather Lane who is expiring a certain license very, very soon. Okay, with reports, just don't remember to save the report and set it to yes, ensure internally.
Yep, if you don't do that, then the workflow won't be able to see it, so that's a critical step. We've already saved this one, so we're just going to go straight to our workflow engine now.
Okay, so setting up this workflow task, we'll give it an appropriate name.
Yep.
Okay, the action we want to select is called the send contact template, because essentially we are sending our trainers an email. Okay, as we scroll down, we're going to skip the middle section in the grey box and head all the way down to when to run. The trigger type we want to set is we're going to select one called report row event, and we're going to select the report that's related to what we were looking at, which is the contact portfolio. Finally, we're going to select a schedule. So I'm going to randomly select one, say at 10 a.m. So if you have missed part 1 of our webinar, we did cover how to set up schedules. So please go and watch part 1.
We also have a short hit of training, which covers how our schedules work as well, if you want to see a more in-depth look specifically at that. To recap, effectively, what we're asking the system to do is every day at 10 a.m., run this report, and then for every row you see on there, perform an action against it. The action we want in this case is to send a message to those people. So we find 3 trainers on that list. We want to send a reminder to all 3 of those people.
Right. So now that this section is set up, let's head back to the middle section. You can see that in the to contacts field, it's been auto-populated with the contact ID because of how the report is set up. So if you see this field in there, that means you're on the right track.
If you see that as empty or it says none in there, that probably means you've removed contact ID from the display fields of your report. So if you have issues with that, just double check how your report is set up. That's always going to be the cause of that problem.
Right, now if you're wondering what aXcelerate is all about, this is also a really good opportunity to demonstrate what this field does. So if you remember in our previous example, Heather Lane did pop up in our report. This particular workflow has been set up to run every day. That means Heather is going to appear in my report pretty much on a daily basis.
Because the report's looking at a date range, so it's saying people who are expiring within the next 90 days. So it's showing Heather today. It's pretty unlikely she would have updated a document by tomorrow, being that quick with it. So when we run the report again tomorrow, she's still within that 90-day range, so she's going to show up again. And because we're asking this workflow to run every single day, it'll send it once today, and probably it'll send her the same message again tomorrow. So so it's probably going to spam her quite a bit if we leave it as is.
Yep. So if you do not want your trainers to be spammed, we are going to pop a value in this field here. So I'm going to pop a value of 30 days. This means that Heather is only going to receive this email once every 30 days.
So although she might show up in the report multiple times, so she may show up today, the workflow will work and send the message. When it runs again tomorrow, she will again show up in there, but the system will understand she has been sent that same message within the last 30 days, so don't do it again. So it's a bit of a cool down to make sure that you can have a workflow running quite regularly, but it doesn't spam people with the message that it wants to send.
That's right. And like in the previous example, we're not going to use a pre-configured template. We are in fact going to jump back to our TV icons again because it does contain some very specific fields not found in the templates area.
So you're probably wanting to tell the trainer about what exactly is expiring. If you go to the templates area, you'll find there's no real field that lets you do that. So we have to put them in here directly into the workflow message.
Yep, as you can see from the drop-down list, there's lots of different fields to choose from, but what I want to look for in particular is the portfolio document type. So I'm going to click OK and include that in my template. Alright, so it's going to pull in the document name, and I'm going to put a descriptor in front of it. Okay, awesome. The next field that I want to pull into the template is one called the expires date. So that's going to tell the trainer when this document is going to expire.
So now when they get the email, it won't just be a generic message. They'll actually say you have this document and it's going to expire on this date. So they should actually get a proper reminder in the message.
That's correct. And as usual, you can always customize it with your own signature if you'd like. And in the subject, I will have to put in a name because we are not using a template here.
Like so.
All right, and that's pretty much all the setup you have to do at this stage. So if you're happy with all the configurations, all you have to do is to save automated task.
Cool. So I've looked at a bit on how to use those unique dynamic fields, and we've started to get into the use of the report row event there, and mainly to send the reminders to trainers about expiring documents. And our next example, we're going to continue looking at the reports. This time, we're going to look at an example of sending a progression warning to students. So this case is going to often occur, especially in a Krykos setting. You have students who are getting close to when they're due to finish, but they've only got such an amount of progression, and you might want to tell those students, pick up the pace because they're not going to meet their completion criteria. So to do this, we're going to head back into the system, and this time we are going to go to the save reports once again and examine something different. The one we have set up for this is this one here, and if we click play, we can have a look at what's configured. And you can see that this is a simple class enrollments warehouse report. So that's just looking at our accredited enrollments. And we've got a few filters in place to make sure we're getting in the students we want. First and foremost, we're only looking at in-progress students. This ensures that if someone's cancelled, they aren't going to show up in this by mistake. And we're also using this competency percentage field. So it's currently looking for people who have less than 70% competency. That just does a total of all the units in someone's enrollment. It figures out how many of that are competent and does a percentage calculation based upon that. So if someone has, less than 70% worth of those units are unfinished, they should show up on this report. Finally, we've put in a completion date here for the current month. This ensures we're only looking at students who are actually due to finish fairly soon. You can probably foresee if you enrolled someone today, their competency percentage is going to be very, very low because they wouldn't have even started, but their end date, their expected completion is probably pretty far into the future. So we're setting it here for students who are due to finish very, very soon, but have actually not got much completion done.
Yep. Now do note that if you do want to set up these filters, it is very important to use the warehouse reports and not the live reports, because warehouse reports do contain statistics and aggregations that's calculated on a daily basis.
Yeah, if you use just a live report of this, you'll find those percentage options are simply not available. So we have to use a warehoused version.
All right, let's jump into the display fields and see what we've got. So by default, these are all the display fields that aXcelerate will provide. So I'm not going to delete or add any at this point, but what you do want to look out for is to make sure that the class ID and the contact ID fields are in there.
Yeah, the contact ID is probably the most important one. That ensures that the message can be sent to the people. The class ID will be also relatively important too, and we'll show why when we set up the workflow task itself. For now, let's click done and we'll check out who's showing up in our report. All right, we have 2 students here. Very low percentage of completion,
yep,
considering they're due to finish this month. So we probably want to let them know fairly soon. So with that report all saved, we'll now head to the workflow area and see about setting up a task for that.
All right, let's give it an appropriate name.
Progression warning. Let's put that in so it's nice and descriptive. Wonderful.
Yep. Now the action we want to select for that is still very much the same. It's send contact template, because we are essentially notifying the students and sending them an email. And similar to the previous workflow, we are going to skip the middle section and scroll down to the trigger type, where we will select our report row event trigger and then selecting the actual report itself. So we have one which is this one over here. And finally, set a schedule. So I will set a weekly schedule in this case.
Yep, so it should run the evening of every Friday according to that schedule. With that put in place, we can see, like before, the to contact section, that's turned to contact ID. So for every row it finds on that report, it should see a contact ID and send a message to that person. We're also going to put a template in here. Unlike before, we don't need any dynamic fields. All the stuff we want should be just built within a template. So we'll just put in one we've configured earlier. So an important point is that this template has been set up to include information about not just the student, but also the course they're studying, the qualification they're in, also the units they've done, so that when they get this warning, they can actually see, oh, I probably need to do these units now. In order for that to work correctly, we also need to make sure that the workflow has the class ID being pulled into it also. You can see it down here. With that in place, it's got that report data class ID. It means when the template runs, it will send to the person, but it will also pull in that course information that we're seeking as well. This is important to consider because that's only showing up because our report has class ID in the display fields. If you leave that out of the display fields or you remove it, that section that we're looking at right now simply won't show up. So if that happens, you would still be able to successfully send the message, but the template will be looking pretty blank. It would have missing data everywhere. So we've made sure to include class ID in the report and double check to make sure it's showing up here.
Yep, so everything looks good here. Finally, you can set a subject name of your choice or let it default to the template name and simply save the automated task.
Cool. So that should send out a reminder to all our students who are getting close to finishing with no progression. As you can imagine, that same sort of setup can be tailored to look at different kinds of student. As we mentioned, if you can get to work in a report, you can get it to feed into workflow. I've seen a similar progression warning set up for students who have kind of like recently cancelled almost. So they recently cancel and then they send out a notice of notification that they have withdrawn. It can be done with the same sort of workflow task.
All right, let's head on to our next workflow example where we're going to look at how to raise invoices if you've got payment plans set up for each student enrollment.
Yeah, so if you've been using the finance features of aXcelerate, you've probably come across this before. You can set up payment plans, break up someone's fees into installments. One downfall that can come with that is that then you have to remember to raise the invoices for those installments when they're actually due. So to help ease that burden, we actually have a specific workflow task to do that for you. So the system can automatically produce the invoices when it knows an installment is due. Like everything else we've looked at today, this too is going to start with a save report. So let's take a look now. The one we're focusing on is this payment plan installments one. Let's hit play and take a look. As you can see, this is a payment plan installments warehouse report. It is specifically named, and we've only set up a few filters here. We've got the payment plan installment invoice. We made sure that is no, so we're only looking at installments that don't yet have an invoice. If they've already got an invoice, there shouldn't be a need to produce it again, so we can ignore all them. We've also set the payment plan installment due date, and we're looking exactly 2 weeks into the future. So we want to know the installments that are 2 weeks from now that they need to be raised, and then we can have the system produce it for us. Lastly, we've included the enrollment status there, and that's the student's enrollment status, to make sure it's in progress. We've done that so that if a student happens to cancel, they don't accidentally start getting invoices produced from them. If they've withdrawn, they probably aren't going to continue paying at this point, so we're going to exclude those people.
All right, let's have a look at the display fields in the report. So by default, once again, we'll leave this as the default because that's what aXcelerate provides. I'm not going to add or delete anything, but it is important to make sure that the installment ID and the enrollment ID are both included in this particular report.
Yep. Probably most critical is that payment plan installment ID. If you remove that for whatever reason, the workflow will have no idea what installment to raise for.
All right, let's hit done.
You'll note there too that there's no contact ID like we've been looking at before either. That's because this automation isn't going to be sending anything. It's literally just going to be creating the installments, the invoices for those. So we don't need to send it to anyone.
That's correct. All right, let's run this report now and see what results it returns.
Cool. So a couple of different students here. They've got installments due, but nothing has been invoiced yet. So let's set up a workflow to do that for us.
So let's go into the new automated task again, give the name an appropriate one. And as Rowan mentioned, there is a very specific action relating to this one. So it is called, if you type payment plan, it's called generate payment plan invoice. So we're going to select that.
That blue text there, it explains how to really set this up. The main takeaway is, of course, that it requires a suitably saved report, which we have already done. I'd also like to point out that this is specifically generate a payment plan invoice. This automation can only work with payment plans. If you have student fees set up as like lump sums or something else, it can't automatically generate the invoices for those. They have to be part of some sort of payment plan.
Right. So once again, we're going to skip the grey box section and head all the way down to the report area. We are going to select the report that we were looking at, which is the payment plan installments, and we're going to set a schedule. Say, for example, in this example, I will choose 10 a.m.
Yep. So every day at 10, the system will attempt to run through this and generate relevant invoices. Up in the middle box now, we're going to click that dynamic value, and it's pulling in that payment plan installment ID that was in the display fields of the report. So as it goes through that report, it'll see each ID number and say, oh, that's missing an invoice. I'll try and create one there now. You can also put in a purchase order number if you so wish. Just bear in mind, you can only put in a single value here. So if you need to apply different purchase order numbers to different sets of invoices, you may have to end up setting up a few different reports and a few different workflows for different kinds of payment plans. Lastly, you'll see a lot of other options here. These relate to just how payment plans are configured. The eyes next to each option explain what these do. We're going to leave these as they are for now, but you may need to tweak these depending on your individual payment plan setup.
Yep. And finally, once you've configured all these, simply save the automated task. And that's how you set up or raise invoices for payment plans.
Excellent. So the last automation we're going to look at today is the automatic sending of invoices. Naturally, after you've actually produced a bunch of invoices, the next step is you probably want to have the system send them for you so you don't have to manually do that. So we'll look at how to configure that part now as a separate automation.
Once again, it's based on a report that we have to save, so we have one sitting in the system.
Yep. Simple one there called invoices raised today. Let's take a look at how it's set up. This is just a simple invoices report, and with a few filters in place, you can see that we have the invoice reversed with credit note. That's it to no. Basically, we don't want to include an invoice if it's being refunded for whatever reason. So that's what that's excluding. Below that, we have the invoice date, which is set to today. The invoice date refers to the date that the invoice was created. So we basically want to say if an invoice was created today, we want to send it out of the system as well. Finally, we've included the invoice is reportable. That's set to yes. That's just a bit of insurance to make sure we don't accidentally send any void or draft invoices to people by mistake. It should only be real invoices that we're actually sending out of the system.
Yep, so if you're new to the reports area in aXcelerate, do note that this is a live report that we're running because we are looking at invoices that are being raised today. Okay, let's just jump into the display fields, and by default we will leave these fields in there because we don't want to take anything out, put anything in. However, we do want to make sure that the invoice ID and the invoice to contact ID is in there, and essentially the invoice to contact ID replaces the contact ID field that we've been covering so far.
Yeah, so they're all about knowing who to send it to. We're going to make sure that both of those display fields are in there, invoice ID and invoice to contact ID. And when we look at the workflow, you'll see how those two will interact.
All right, so let's go done and run the report.
Cool. Got a few invoices sitting in there that are ready to be sent. Importantly, note that the last automation we saw, that can only generate invoices that are part of a payment plan. However, for sending invoices, that will work with any invoice. These two here have actually been manually created in the system today, and we can still send those automatically out. So generation can only be partially automated. Setting invoices, that can be completely automated, and that's what we'll do here.
Okay, so let's go ahead and set up this workflow. Give it a name. And yep. Now the action we're going to select is once again a send contact template action because we are emailing our students their invoices. So once again, we'll skip the grey box, move all the way down to the final section, choose your trigger type as report row event, and select your report. Okay, and we're going to select a schedule to run. Now this time I'm selecting one that's running later in the day, so that's taking place after the payment plan invoices have been generated.
Yep, those are being generated at 10 a.m, whereas the sending of invoices is going to occur at 4 p.m. Naturally, if you try and send something before it's raised, it's not going to work. So when you're configuring these automations, make sure your generation is before your sending automation.
So as I move up to the grey box, you will see that this particular field is empty. So if you come into that situation, all you have to do is to click on dynamic value to populate the area.
You can see it's pulling in the invoice to contact ID. So for every contact ID it finds on that report, it should try and send them that message. If you're not seeing that for whatever reason, again, just check your report's display fields. Make sure those are included. If that's not there, then it can't pull it into the automation that we're seeing.
So we do have a pre-configured template for this because these fields are found within the templates area. Okay.
And now that template we've set there, what that is it's the email that is sent to the student. It's not the invoice, it's just a very simple message that says, "Dear so-and-so, you have an invoice, please find attached." To configure the invoice and actually ensure that it is attached to that email, we're going to focus on those last two bits there, the invoice attachment section. So if you've been using Finance and aXcelerate before, you probably already have a template for invoices. The one we have is called tax invoice receipt. Just click on that there, like so. So that will sort of pull in all the invoice information, put it into a PDF, and then attach it to the email template we set above. Importantly, that's only going to work because we also have that invoice attachment section pulling in the invoice ID. Similar to what we saw before with that whole class ID, that's only appearing because invoice ID is in that report we have saved. If you don't include that there, then there may be no attachment that's actually included. So we might end up sending a message to the student saying, "Hey, you have an invoice attached, but nothing's actually included." But we have set it up correctly, so it should produce their invoice as a PDF and attach it to their final email.
So once you're happy with the configuration, all you have to do is to save automated task, and these workflows will start running from whenever you have designated so.
Yep. So I've gone through a number of automations today. A lot of them to do with around a lot of automated reminders, as we saw before. A lot of heavy use of the report builder this time though. So as you've seen, if you can't get simple automations working with these triggers or conditions, you can often build a suitable report that can act as sort of a mass triggering condition for you. So sending it out to all the people under a progression percentage, all of your raised invoices, that can all be done with the examples that we've seen today. Hopefully this has given you some idea of the more advanced things you can do and set up with the workflow automation engine. If you check our shot series, there are also some other tasks that we haven't covered here today and more things to do with workshops, and we encourage you to check those out as well if you remain interested. Thank you very much for joining us though. If you have any questions sitting in the chat that we weren't able to get to, we'll take note of those and answer them in a follow-up email later from today. But thank you very much for joining us.
Yep, thanks so much. See ya.
Bye for now. And do bear in mind, make sure you tune in for our next webinar. We'll send through dates as that gets closer. We'll be looking at our timetabling. So if you're interested in tracking lessons or scheduling attendance, we'll be covering those in our next session, and we hope to see you there.